Lakeland Public Television's Common Ground is brought to you by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund.
Me, I'm Wes Ellis. Yeah, the Big Depression hit before the Dust Bowls. When I was about in the 8th grade, that's when hard times hit, and you couldn't sell anything and get anything for it because the bottom dropped right out to where oats was 6 cents, barley was 8, wheat was 35, and so on. And you couldn't sell cattle because you'd owe shipping charges. The only thing we dared to ship was hogs if we knew they were top. You could get a little bit out of a truckload of hogs at 2.5 cents. That was tops for hogs. But you better not ship hogs unless you knew they were tops, otherwise you'd owe transportation. So then it went from that into a drought. And that started out, well, I was plowing in the fall, and we'd had a bumper crop, but biggest crop I can remember of. And while I was plowing, the dirt started to drift till I couldn't see the ground from where I was sitting on the plow, plowing with horses, of course. And so I couldn't tell if I was staying in the furrow or not. So I put the horses up in the barn. And I went in the house, and my mother was home alone, and I looked out the window and I said, "Come look out the window. You'll probably never see this again." Just then we couldn't see the windmill. There was a cloud of dust so heavy you couldn't see the windmill. Well, it went from that to much, much worse. The dust storms got so heavy that there were times when it was darker than any night you could imagine. Now, how we managed to live through all of that dust, I have no idea, because we breathed it steadily, even if the wind wasn't blowing, while there was still dust in the air. There was days when the wind wasn't blowing that you couldn't see the sun because of the amount of dust in the air. It was just a kind of a glow. You just lived in a sort of a glow. And horses and cattle started starving to death. And the only money I was making was skinning a horse once in a while. Because, well, the only reason I got to skin a horse was because a farmer there would probably have a horse that he'd had so long he thought so much of it that he couldn't shoot it and take the hide off, so he'd come to me. "If you want the hide, you can do away with that old horse for me." But otherwise, the farmers skinned their own horses because that was their only source of money too. Well, then that was the time of Franklin D. Roosevelt was president, and he started buying up, the cattle were condemned, and they would buy them up for a little or nothing, and then would give the farmers something to eat on. And then they dug deep trenches and drove the cattle in there and shot them and covered them up. So I went and applied for a job shooting cattle. And they said, "No, we don't have a job for you." I said, "If it's marksmanship you want, I am a good shot. And if you wish, I'll demonstrate." "No," they said, "it isn't that. We have to save what jobs there are for the school teachers." And I said, "That don't sound very fair to me because they got 8 months' work the way it is, and I have none." Well, they said they figured that government figures that teaching is very important, so we gotta do something to keep the teachers occupied. That's when I decided I got to leave the country because you can't live without a little bit of money. So I talked to a neighbor boy and I said, "I'm getting out of here and I says, I hear it's better if we go west. He says, I'd sure like to go along. I says, I sure need you along. He said, I don't think my folks let me go, though. Anyway, I seen him 3 days later, and he said, I can go with you. He said, my folks says, as long as it's you that's going, I'm going with I can go with you. Well, that made me feel pretty good. I didn't know I had that good a reputation. So anyway, we headed west. Well, I'd rode the freight train otherwise too, because I'd rode it 4 times over the big hump in a side door Pullman. That's a boxcar. And the big hump is the Rocky Mountains. That's the only way you get any place of stealing a ride on the freight train. So anyway, that was the beginning of our trip west. Going west, Aberdeen, South Dakota was the first big terminal. So then from then on, why, it was dry and hot. Across, I call it desert. You get west of the Missouri River, why it's cactus and sagebrush clear the Rocky Mountains. It's exhausting riding a freight train because very seldom do you get a boxcar that'll ride smooth. It's always bouncing. On a shaky boxcar was some flat wheel. And sometimes they were so flat that it would have shook you apart. So we'd have to put our hands on the floor like this and our feet on the floor and take the jolt there. Otherwise, I think it would have killed the guy. So you got so exhausted, you slept. But when there's two, why, that's one guy generally stays awake while one sleeps, because there's good guys on the freight and there's bad guys too. There's a couple of my friends didn't make it. Somebody hit them on the head just in case they had a little money on them. And it was a slow climb with the train up into the mountains. One place I called Louis' attention to it. I said, hey, come here, take a look. I said, you can see where we were this morning. And this was in the evening. We went up a cliff. I could see 6 railroads beneath us, like stair steps. And I know I could have threw a stone back to where we'd been that morning. Well, then it got dark, so I don't know, the next morning we was clear up at the top of the Rockies. And it was cold up there. I mean, it was really cold. Snow all over, and I bet it was 0, maybe even colder than that. We had to huddle together to keep from freezing. And we were lucky we had a comedian in the bunch. He started singing When It's Springtime in the Rockies. And that made us all laugh, you know, with some of his other comics. And I think that helped keep our circulation going.
If you enjoyed this segment of Lakeland Public Television's Common Ground, consider making a contribution at lptv.org. If you have segment ideas pertaining to North Central Minnesota, contact us at legacy@lptv.org. Common Ground is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund by the vote of the people on November 4th, 2008.